you so much for talking to us. This is a slightly peculiar, unusual way of doing an interview. We are living in very unusual times at the moment.
At 8:41 on the morning of December 18th, Buckingham Palace issued a statement so absolute and so formally severe that even those who had anticipated some sort of clarification were shocked by how final it was, with King Charles himself speaking through official channels and wording bearing his direct authorization, confirming what many had suspected but hoped would never be officially declared: that Sarah Ferguson's separation from royal life was permanent, irreversible, and would include full exclusion from all future family events of any kind. And the statement shattered royal precedent as the announcement appeared on Buckingham Palace letterhead, carrying the weight of a formal royal decree rather than the gentler language usually employed for family matters, with the opening line making instantly clear that this was no routine clarification as it read: His Majesty the King has authorized the following statement regarding the Duchess of York's relationship to the royal family and the Crown. And what followed was without precedent in modern royal history, a reigning monarch in his official capacity publicly and formally defining the permanent exclusion of his former sister-in-law from royal life, while confirming that Sarah Ferguson would not be reinstated to any royal provisions, would not be welcomed at any official or unofficial royal family gatherings, and would remain permanently outside the institutional and familial structures of the monarchy. But it was the statement's final paragraph that revealed why the announcement felt tragic rather than merely procedural, with the wording stating, "This decision brings His Majesty no satisfaction," noting that the Duchess of York had been part of the family for nearly 4 decades and that her daughters remained beloved members, yet circumstances required institutional clarity that, however painful, could no longer be delayed. And that admission of sadness turned what could have been a sterile bureaucratic declaration into something more human and thus more devastating, since Charles was not simply removing Sarah from royal association but acknowledging that doing so caused him personal hurt even as duty required him to authorize it. And within minutes the BBC interrupted morning programming as the anchor read the statement slowly and then looked directly into the camera, calling it extraordinary that King Charles had personally confirmed the permanent exclusion of Sarah Ferguson from royal life, in the most definitive terms used by any modern monarch, while acknowledging his own sadness about the necessity, describing it as institutional duty overriding personal preference in the starkest possible way, while Sky News gathered constitutional experts and royal historians who struggled to find precedent for a monarch personally issuing such a statement about a former family member, with one historian noting that although various royals had been excluded or exiled throughout history, a king personally authorizing public confirmation of such exclusion was almost without parallel in the past century. And the Times captured the moment's tragedy with the headline, "King issues personal statement confirming Sarah Ferguson's permanent royal exile," while the Telegraph emphasized institutional implications with Monarch draws final line, "Duchess of York will never return," and The Guardian focused on emotional weight with Charles's painful duty, King confirms former sister-in-law's permanent exclusion. And across the Atlantic, American networks highlighted the finality and Charles's seeming reluctance, with CNN describing a king compelled to formalize the exclusion of his brother's ex-wife while acknowledging his own sadness even as duty demanded definitive action, and CBS noting that this was not a decision Charles wanted to make but rather one that circumstances required him to no longer postpone. And outside Buckingham Palace, where steady winter rain fell, a small crowd gathered after news of the statement broke, standing in silence as they processed what the announcement meant, with one elderly woman telling the BBC, "He's had to tell her officially that she can never come back, that she's not family anymore, and even when you understand the reasons, it's heartbreaking." While inside the palace, senior staff who had worked on the careful wording of the statement moved through their duties with visible solemnity, knowing they had helped draft one of the saddest documents of Charles's reign, a formal declaration that someone who had been part of the family for nearly 4 decades was now permanently, officially, irreversibly excluded. And Princess Anne, when asked for comment during a morning engagement, said only, "His Majesty has done what duty required. That it was painful for him makes it no less necessary," acknowledging both the correctness of the decision and the emotional cost of making it. But perhaps most striking was what the statement revealed about Charles himself. As for months he had resisted making any formal announcement about Sarah's status, hoping that informal arrangements and the passage of time would be enough. And the fact that he finally authorized such definitive language suggested that circumstances had forced his hand, that continuing without formal clarity had become impossible, and that his role as king ultimately outweighed his preferences as a man who had known Sarah since 1986 and watched her become part of his family. And as the December morning progressed and the weight of Charles's announcement settled across the royal landscape, one truth became undeniable. This was not a statement the king wished to make, but a statement he was compelled to issue by institutional, legal, and familial pressures that had accumulated to a point where silence was no longer sustainable. And by making it, he formalized a tragedy that all involved would carry forward, the permanent severing of bonds that had once been assumed to be, if not unbreakable, at least enduring. She was no longer family in any sense that carried institutional significance, and Charles, in making that declaration, was forcing himself to prioritize institutional duty over personal preference in the most explicit, recorded, and irreversible way possible. With the family conversations before the announcement reflecting that the 48 hours leading up to Charles authorizing the statement's release were filled with difficult discussions that revealed the human dimensions behind institutional decisions, where what appeared publicly as a formal palace decree had emerged from private exchanges marked by tears, frustration, reluctant acceptance, and the kind of familial pain that no amount of protocol could alleviate. And Charles's first step once he finally accepted the statement's necessity was personally calling Beatrice and Eugenie, with the calls made from his private study at Clarence House on the evening of December 16th becoming among the most emotionally difficult conversations of his reign, as he reached Beatrice first and began with, "I need to tell you something that will cause you pain," his voice already strained, explaining that he had authorized a formal statement concerning her mother's relationship to the family, confirming that her exclusion was permanent and that she would not be welcome at family events. And Beatrice's silence lasted so long that Charles wondered if the call had disconnected, and when she eventually spoke, her voice was thick with emotion as she said, "You are formally banning our mother from family gatherings, from Christmas, from weddings, from anything involving family." And Charles responded gently that he was formalizing what had already been an informal reality and that her mother had chosen to build her life in Portugal, and the statement merely clarified what that meant for her relationship to royal life and family events, emphasizing that it was not punishment but documentation of reality. And yet Beatrice's reply came sharp through her tears as she said it felt like punishment and felt like he was ensuring her mother could never return, even if circumstances evolved, closing doors that should have remained slightly open. And Charles heard in her tone the pain of a daughter watching her mother be formally cast out, and told her that he wished circumstances allowed different choices, but that institutional ambiguity regarding her mother's status had become untenable, and that this clarity, however painful, was necessary. And the call with Eugenie an hour later followed similar contours, but with additional bitterness as she asked how they would explain this to their children, that their grandmother was not welcome at family events and that the king had formally excluded her. And Charles had no comforting answer except to reiterate necessity and express genuine sadness that duty required choices that created such pain. And both calls ended with strained goodbyes, his nieces devastated, and Charles feeling the weight of what he had authorized in ways theoretical discussions had not prepared him for. And the conversation with Andrew was shorter and more volatile as Charles called him on the morning of December 17th to inform him of the forthcoming statement, and Andrew immediately erupted with anger, accusing Charles of formally excluding Sarah from family events, the mother of his daughters, and claiming that after everything she had done, standing by him when others had abandoned him and supporting him through his crisis, this was the repayment for her loyalty. And Charles responded firmly despite emotional exhaustion, telling him that Sarah chose to relocate to Portugal and that the statement provided clarity regarding what that choice meant, and that if Andrew sought someone to blame for the circumstances requiring her removal from provisions and now her formal exclusion, he should examine his own role in creating the situation. And the conversation deteriorated and ended with Andrew hanging up without saying goodbye, leaving Charles in his study feeling the fracture between them deepen in ways that might never be repaired, though he would not retreat from what necessity demanded even if family relationships were damaged as a consequence. And Princess Anne, having been briefed on the statement's content and timing, offered exactly the support Charles needed, direct and without emotional entanglement, telling him during a brief meeting at Windsor that he was doing what his role required and that the fact it caused him personal pain demonstrated his humanity, but that duty sometimes required humanity to take second place to institutional necessity, and that Sarah's situation had required formal resolution for months and he was finally providing it. Anne's uniquely blunt but sincere support steadied him more effectively than emotional reassurance ever could, as she understood institutional duty more deeply than almost anyone in the family, having spent her entire life placing service above personal inclination. While Queen Camilla's approach was more personal as she found Charles in his study on the evening of December 17th, noticed the exhaustion on his face, and sat with him quietly before telling him gently that he was a good man in an impossible position and was choosing to hurt people he cared about in order to protect an institution serving millions, that the choice was correct even when it felt cruel, and that he was allowed to grieve what his duty required, and her acknowledgement that he could be right and sorrowful at the same time gave Charles permission to feel the full emotional burden instead of suppressing it in the name of duty, allowing him to integrate necessity with humanity rather than choosing between them. And the final conversation before he authorized the statement's release was with William, whom he met at Buckingham Palace on the morning of December 18th to review the language one last time. And William, seeing his father's exhaustion, asked whether he was certain he could proceed because he looked devastated, and Charles replied softly but firmly that he was devastated but also certain because the statement was necessary and Sarah's status could not remain undefined, and that informal ambiguity had created problems for everyone, including her daughters, and so he could proceed even though he would carry the sadness. And William briefly placed a hand on his shoulder, saying that history would judge it as a difficult but correct decision, and that Charles's willingness to acknowledge the pain rather than pretending institutional duty came easily would be remembered as a mark of a king who understood his humanity even as his role demanded difficult decisions. And at 8:41 that morning the statement was released, and Charles, seated in his study at Clarence House, felt the weight of what he had irrevocably set in motion settle over him like a winter cold that would not lift. And the immediate aftermath revealed how profoundly the announcement affected everyone involved, as the hours following the release sent waves of sadness, frustration, and reluctant acceptance across continents. With Sarah in Portugal learning of the announcement not privately but through news alerts on her phone while having morning coffee on her terrace overlooking the Atlantic, and reading the statement twice before staring silently at the ocean, and friends later describing her as in shock, not furious or betrayed, but numbly stunned by seeing her worst fears confirmed in formal, irreversible language. And though she had already understood she was excluded and accepted that her life would be in Portugal, seeing it documented and personally authorized by Charles made the reality concrete in ways for which she was unprepared, telling a close friend that evening, "I am officially not family anymore, not in any sense that matters. The king has formally declared it. There is no ambiguity left and no door even slightly open. I am permanently outside and it is documented forever." And Beatrice and Eugenie, though they knew the statement was coming, had hoped the language might be softer but maintained public silence while struggling privately, continuing their engagements with carefully composed expressions that could not hide the pain. And palace staff who had worked closely with Sarah during her royal lodge years felt the announcement heavily, as many had known her as someone who tried, who made mistakes but kept attempting to improve, who showed warmth even in her darkest times, and seeing her formally excluded in such definitive language felt like witnessing the final chapter of a tragedy unfolding for decades. With one longtime staff member saying anonymously that while they understood the necessity of clarity, seeing the king personally authorize her permanent exclusion made it real in a way discussions never had, and she was gone and not coming back, and that had been made official. And British public reaction was mixed, with early polling showing 58% believed the statement necessary for institutional clarity while 41% expressed sympathy for Sarah, feeling permanent exclusion seemed harsh even if removing provisions had been justified. And older viewers, especially women who had followed her journey since the 1980s, expressed unexpected emotion, with radio call-ins from listeners moved to tears by the finality and by Charles's acknowledgement of his sadness, saying he hadn't wanted to do it but did because his role required it, making it tragic in the truest sense. And American media focused on the emotional cost, with morning shows debating whether monarchy justified such personal pain and opinion pieces questioning institutions that demanded complete exclusion of someone who had been family for decades, and social media arguing over whether Charles showed strong leadership or unnecessary cruelty, while royal commentators and constitutional experts emphasized the unprecedented nature of a monarch personally authorizing such a statement, noting he could have allowed palace officials to clarify Sarah's status without his direct involvement, but his decision to put his name and his acknowledgement of sadness into the document revealed his sense of responsibility, with one expert noting that Charles was accepting ownership of the decision rather than allowing faceless institutional machinery to take the blame, making his approach nearly unprecedented in modern monarchy. And Princess Anne, when asked for comment, simply said the statement spoke for itself and that the king had provided clarity that circumstances required, which for her was strong support. And by evening on December 18th the initial shock faded into long-term recognition that Charles had formalized what many assumed but nobody wished to see documented, that Sarah Ferguson was permanently, officially, and irreversibly excluded from royal life and family, authorized directly by the king with acknowledgement of sadness, and everyone involved, Sarah in Portugal, her daughters in London, Charles in his study, would carry the weight of this separation into a future where reconciliation was no longer merely difficult but formally impossible. And as the implications crystallized in the following days, attention turned to what permanent formal exclusion meant, with Sarah's situation shifting from ambiguous to defined as she had existed in limbo where exclusion was practiced but not formalized and theoretically reversible, and the statement removed that ambiguity, making her officially and permanently outside the royal family in every meaningful way, extinguishing any hope for future reconciliation. And the psychological impact of definitive rejection was immense after nearly 4 decades of royal connection, first as Andrew's wife, then as his ex-wife who remained within the family fabric, then as someone removed from provisions but still Duchess of York. And now even that residual tie was severed and she became simply Sarah Ferguson of Portugal, defined only by a past relationship to an institution she no longer had claim to. And for Beatrice and Eugenie, their mother's exclusion created an impossible ongoing reality as they remained working royals attending family events while their mother was permanently barred, meaning every Christmas, wedding, and milestone would occur without her, not due to distance but because the king had formally declared her unwelcome, forcing the sisters into lifelong navigation of dual loyalties with no comfortable middle ground, as attending royal events meant participating in a family that excluded their mother while visiting her in Portugal meant stepping outside the circle that rejected her, making one side always feel like a betrayal of the other. And palace officials, after obtaining the clarity they sought, now had to implement it consistently, planning future events around her documented exclusion and structuring family gatherings with her absence as a deliberate policy, institutionalizing a permanent void around someone who had once been integrated into royal operations. And for Charles, the announcement represented a personal loss even though it achieved institutional clarity, as he had authorized permanent exclusion of someone he had known for nearly 40 years, someone who was mother to his nieces, someone who had shown loyalty to his troubled brother. And while the decision was institutionally correct, it felt personally wrong, leaving him subdued in private discussions afterward as he carried the weight of having formalized a separation that would outlast him and define Sarah's relationship to the family for the remainder of her life and beyond. And in observing this situation, it becomes clear that formal exclusion carries a unique cruelty as informal distance, however painful, maintains the illusion of possible reconciliation while formal exclusion removes that hope with documented finality, making Charles's statement not just exclusion but permanent placement into institutional history, nearly impossible to reverse without extraordinary action that circumstances suggest will never occur. And the precedent now warns future royals that stepping back while trying to retain partial association risks permanent exclusion, establishing that royal titles and belonging are conditional and revocable when circumstances demand, serving institutional order while chilling attempts at nuanced arrangements. And as the chapter closes, several truths remain evident: that Charles issued an announcement he never wanted to make, authorizing permanent exclusion of someone he had known since 1986. And his statement provided institutional clarity while acknowledging personal sadness, showing that duty and humanity can coexist even when they clash. And Sarah Ferguson's separation is now formally documented and permanent, eliminating all ambiguity and all remaining hope. And Beatrice and Eugenie must navigate impossible dual loyalties, and Charles himself bears the emotional cost of a decision both necessary and devastating, illustrating that being king sometimes requires choosing institutional necessity over personal compassion, delivering outcomes that cause genuine suffering to those he cares about. And ultimately, Charles's tragic announcement was not cruelty or punishment but a king providing the clarity institutional function required, even when that clarity formalized separations everyone wished could have been avoided. And whether this decision represents strength or a failure of imagination regarding alternatives may never be fully settled. But its finality is undeniable, as Sarah Ferguson is permanently excluded from royal life, not by informal practice but by formal decree, not temporarily but forever, defining relationships and institutional boundaries for decades to come.